What we're about to explore isn't some fleeting story, something pulled from the noise of the 24-hour news cycle. This is not a trending headline. It's not designed to grab your attention for a day, only to be forgotten tomorrow. We're going to set aside the noise, the sensationalism, all the minute-by-minute updates that so often just obscure the bigger picture. We're stepping back. We're going to try to see the whole forest, not just the individual trees. And this isn't about some sudden crisis either, some unexpected eruption that just seems to come out of nowhere. The events that dominate our screens, the conflicts, the trade disputes, the political drama, they're often just the symptoms, not the actual disease. They're the visible waves on the surface. But our goal here is to understand the deep, powerful currents that are moving underneath it all. We're looking for the cause, the structural forces that actually create the headlines in the first place. We're looking for something deeper, a pattern, when it rarely makes a sound, but always shapes the outcome. It's like a hidden current beneath the surface of world affairs, a current that quietly guides the flow of power, of conflict, and yes, of cooperation. It's the invisible architecture that dictates why certain nations rise, why others clash, and why the whole global order feels so profoundly unstable right now. What we're examining is more structural. It's a force that doesn't show up in a breaking news alert or a tweet, but it influences almost every major geopolitical decision being made by leaders in Washington, in Beijing, and in Moscow. It is the underlying framework of our world, a foundation that today's events are actually built on. This is about something more permanent, not a temporary alliance or some fleeting rivalry, but a fundamental arrangement of global power, one that has quietly taken shape over the last 2 decades. And understanding this structure, this permanent architecture, that's the key to making any sense of our turbulent present, and from having any chance of anticipating the shape of our future. So this underlying architecture, it actually has a name. It's a concept that analysts are starting to use to make sense of our era. They call it the geometry of power. And it's a new way of seeing the world, not as just a chaotic mess of random events, but as a stable, interconnected, and deeply consequential structure. It suggests that global power isn't random at all. It has a shape, a logic, and predictable points of tension. And right at the heart of this geometry is a very specific, very powerful shape, the new cold triangle. At one corner you have the United States, which we'll explore as the world's network superpower. At another, you have China, the world's production and infrastructure superpower. And at the third corner is Russia, which acts as the world's strategic disruption superpower. Their relationship isn't a simple rivalry. It's a complex, geometric balance of influence, stable in some ways, incredibly tense in others, and connected across almost every continent and every major supply chain on the planet. But why a triangle, right? Why this specific shape? Why not a bipolar world, like the last Cold War, or maybe a multipolar world with 5 or 6 equal players? Well, it's because in this era of historic transition, global power hasn't spread out evenly, and it hasn't clustered into 2 neat opposing blocks like it did last century. Instead, for reasons we're about to unpack, it's coalesced around 3 distinct load-bearing pillars of the international system. Each one is essential, and each one is fundamentally different from the others. Think of it like this. Each of these 3 powers anchors a different, essential system that our modern world runs on. The United States manages the global network of finance, security, and alliances. That's kind of the software of the international order. China, on the other hand, architects the global system of production, manufacturing, and infrastructure. That's the hardware of the global economy. And Russia? Russia wields the power of strategic disruption, using its unique assets to alter the global balance and secure its own interests. These 3 systems are not separate. They are constantly interacting, pulling, balancing, and counterbalancing each other, just like the sides of a triangle. To really understand our world, we have to understand each of these corners, one by one. So let's start with the first corner of the triangle, the United States. To get its role today, we have to look past the daily political noise and the whole narrative of inevitable decline. We have to look at the deep architecture of its power. In this new geometry, the U.S. isn't a traditional empire or some lone hegemon. It's the manager of the world's most complex and deeply integrated network. And this network is built on foundations of just immense and, honestly, often underestimated scale. It starts with a $27 trillion economy driven by innovation and services. It's reinforced by a global alliance system of over 60 nations, forming a security web that spans the entire globe. The U.S. dollar, well, it remains the undeniable bedrock of the financial world, underpinning something like 90% of all international flows. That gives Washington incredible leverage. Then you add to that a defense network with a presence everywhere, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, securing the world's shipping lanes, and finally, a tech ecosystem radiating out from Silicon Valley that still leads in the foundational technologies of the future, AI, space, and cyber. But here's the thing. This power isn't static, it's evolving. The U.S. is in the middle of a really profound strategic shift, moving away from that old post-Cold War model where it carried the whole burden of global security to a much more sustainable network model of distributed strength. And you see the evidence for this everywhere. Japan is bubbling its defense spending. Australia, through the AUKUS Pact, is getting nuclear-powered submarines, a huge increase in its strategic weight. Across Europe, nations are raising their defense budgets in a coordinated way, and NATO itself is restructuring its whole deterrence posture. So this isn't a story of American decline, it's a story of strategic adaptation. The United States is still the central hub of the global system, but now it's managing a network where its allies are sharing more of the load. Alright, so now let's turn to the second corner of the triangle, the one occupied by China. And its role, its logic, its sources of strength, they are profoundly different. See, China isn't trying to manage the existing global network, and it's not trying to copy the American model. It is building something else entirely, a parallel system. It is constructing a self-reliant, industrial civilization state, all architected around the immense power of production. China's power is forged in the material world. It comes from an industrial scale and manufacturing ecosystems so vast they can literally reshape entire global markets. Just consider this. It's the only country in history to simultaneously dominate the production of steel, the installation of solar panels, and the processing of critical rare earth minerals. It now leads the world in battery production, shipbuilding, and making electric vehicles. Its companies, like Huawei, built the hardware for a huge chunk of the world's 5G telecom networks. And through its Bolt and Road initiative, it has become the #1 global leader in building ports, high-speed rail, and other critical infrastructure, weaving its production power directly into the fabric of the global economy. But, and this is a huge but, this immense strength exists right alongside some deep structural challenges, and that creates a real sense of urgency in Beijing. China is facing a demographic cliff, a rapidly aging population and a shrinking workforce that's going to challenge its whole economic model. It's also grappling with dangerously high youth unemployment and the incredible debt trapped inside its massive property sector. So this dual reality of incredible power and significant internal pressure is why Beijing sees the next few years as a critical, maybe even a closing window. By its 2027 goal, it wants full military modernization, dominant regional influence, and resilience against foreign pressure, especially in critical sectors like advanced semiconductors. China isn't just rising without friction, and it's not collapsing either. It's transforming at a historic pace, and that process is creating both uncertainty and immense friction across the whole global system. And that brings us to the third and final corner of the triangle, Russia. Its power doesn't come from the size of its economy or its manufacturing capacity, but from something older, more elemental. In this new geometry, Russia's role is that of the great strategic disruptor, a power that is uniquely capable of changing the global equilibrium through its specific assets and its demonstrated willingness to use them. Russian power is rooted in hard fundamentals that often get overlooked in purely economic analyses. Its geography is just continental, spanning 11 time zones and bordering critical strategic regions in both Europe and Asia. It sits on top of the world's largest reserves of natural resources, which gives it immense leverage over global energy and commodity markets. It has a resilient military and a formidable intelligence tradition, both forged over centuries of great power competition. And underpinning everything, giving it a permanent seat at the top table, is its possession of the world's largest nuclear arsenal. That is the ultimate deterrent and the final guarantee of its sovereignty and its global relevance. You see, Moscow understands it cannot compete head-on with American financial power or Chinese industrial scale. So instead, it has mastered the use of asymmetric tools to get high impact with limited means. It uses sophisticated cyber operations to disrupt its adversaries. It leverages its control over energy pipelines and grain exports to exert political pressure. It uses its vast nuclear arsenal for high-stakes coercive diplomacy. It projects power abroad through private military contractors, strategic arms sales to key partners, and advanced capabilities in areas like electronic warfare. Russia isn't seeking global leadership in the same way the US or China is. It's seeking security, leverage, and a guaranteed seat at the table. And its capacity for disruption makes it an unavoidable and often unpredictable part of the global equation. Okay, so we have our three great powers, the network manager, the production architect, and the strategic disruptor. But they don't exist in a vacuum. Their interests, their systems, and their ambitions collide, overlap, and compete across a global chessboard. To really understand how this triangle works in practice, we can look at 6 primary zones where this dynamic is most actively shaping events. The first and most critical zone is the Indo-Pacific. It's become the undisputed geopolitical center of gravity for the 21st century. Here, the U.S. network is trying to preserve freedom of navigation and uphold its alliances, while China's expanding production power seeks strategic depth and regional dominance. The flashpoints are numerous, and they are dangerous. The status of Taiwan, the escalating territorial disputes in the South China Sea, North Korea's nuclear program, and the deepening military pacts like AUKUS. This is the region where a miscalculation carries the highest risk of global escalation. Now, over in Eastern Europe, we see a different side of the triangle, where the interests of the United States and Russia meet in a direct collision. The core tension is all about NATO's defensive posture versus Russia's security doctrine. It's a fundamental and seemingly irreconcilable conflict of worldviews. We see this playing out most violently in the war in Ukraine, but it's also visible in the politics of energy pipelines, the deployment of missile systems, and the persistent, frozen conflicts simmering across the region. And China? Well, it's not a direct military player here, but you can bet it is watching this confrontation very carefully, learning critical strategic lessons from the collision between the other two powers. Moving north and east from Europe, we find two vast and interconnected zones. In Central Asia, a region where all three powers have deep interests, there's this quiet competition unfolding. China's economic influence is growing daily through massive trade and infrastructure projects, while Russia works to maintain its deep historic security and political ties. And then further north, the Arctic is rapidly changing from a frozen wasteland into a central arena for global competition. As the ice melts, new shipping routes are opening up, vast resources are becoming accessible, and what are we seeing? Russia is actively militarizing its northern coastline. The U.S. and its NATO allies are expanding surveillance, and China is strategically positioning itself as a near-Arctic state, ready to play a role in the region's future. In the Middle East, this triangular geometry really shows up as a complex balancing act. The era of just picking one side, it's over. Regional powers, especially the influential Gulf states, are no longer tying their fate to a single great power partner. No, instead they are skillfully navigating the triangle. They look to China as the main long-term buyer for their energy, they look to Russia for security cooperation and diplomatic leverage, and they continue to look to the United States for its long-standing defense guarantees and with the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Then you have the Chinese model, centered on manufacturing, state-led infrastructure, and long-term industrial planning, guided by massive state-owned enterprises, which makes it the linchpin of global supply chains. The Russian model, by contrast, relies on its vast natural resources, using its control over energy and commodities as powerful tools of strategic coercion. These three models are not just different, they are in direct competition to shape the rules of the 21st century global economy. So, given this complex, three-pillared world, how are other nations, the ones outside the three main corners, responding to all this? The old Cold War logic of just choosing a side and joining a bloc, that no longer applies. We've entered a new era, which some are calling the age of flexible alignment. In this new world, the main goal for most nations isn't to be a loyal ally anymore, but to be a savvy navigator. In this new geometry of power, most countries understand that picking one side just means cutting yourself off from the immense benefits offered by the other two. So instead of choosing a side, they're learning to position themselves strategically inside the triangle, choosing their angle to maximize their security, their prosperity, and their own national autonomy. And you see this strategic multi-alignment everywhere you look. India masterfully balances deep relationships with all three powers. Saudi Arabia relies on the U.S. for its ultimate defense umbrella, on China as its top economic partner, and on Russia to coordinate global energy policy. Turkey, a NATO member, actively negotiates between Western and Eastern blocs to advance its own interests. Even staunch U.S. allies like Japan and the nations of Europe face this complex reality. They are tied to the U.S. for their security, but they remain deeply integrated with China for their economic health. This is the new, complicated normal of 21st century diplomacy. So what does this stable but competitive triangular system lead? Well, analysts are tracking 5 plausible trajectories. The most likely, many believe, is a state of competitive coexistence, a world of high competition and intense tech rivalry, but with diplomatic guardrails in place to avoid direct, large-scale conflict. Another possibility is a world of fragmented economic blocs, where regional supply chains eventually replace global ones. A more dangerous path is an accelerating arms race in new domains like space and AI. The biggest immediate risk is a major crisis through miscalculation, say a naval collision in the South China Sea, or a massive cyber attack that just escalates unexpectedly. And finally, over the long term, there's the possibility of power diffusion, where rising powers like India or Brazil cause the triangle to slowly evolve into a more complex, multi-sided shape. We started this journey by looking for something deeper than the daily headlines, a more structural, more permanent pattern to make sense of all the noise. And this geometry of power, this great triangle of influence, it provides that structure. It's not a perfect model, but it is an architecture for clarity in an increasingly complex time. Understanding this framework lets us see the world and the news differently. It reveals that the fundamental dynamic of our time is not necessarily a simple story of impending war between good and evil. It is a story of architecture, of competing systems, of competing visions for how the world should be designed, and of the structural logic that connects them all. 3 distinct powers, 3 competing systems, 1 interconnected global structure. The United States, acting as the manager of the global network. China, serving as the engine of global production, and Russia, playing the role of the strategic disruptor. Together, they form the inescapable geometry that is shaping our century. When we see the world as nothing more than a chaotic and random series of unrelated crises, the natural result is confusion. We feel overwhelmed, powerless to understand the forces at play. And that confusion, when it's left unchecked, inevitably creates fear. We fear what we do not understand, and that fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the future, the fear of miscalculation, is what drives instability in the global system. It is what fuels arms races, breaks down diplomacy, and makes conflict more likely. But by understanding the architecture, by seeing the geometry of power for what it is, we can begin to replace that confusion with clarity. And clarity, genuine, factual clarity about the forces shaping our world, is the essential first step toward building a more predictable and therefore more stable future. It is the beginning of navigating our turbulent world, not with fear, but with understanding.